Welcome to a lecture on Ernest Hemingway's In Our Time. A couple goals for those of you who are reviewing this lecture in order to be able to write the paper on associative cycling in Our Time. We hope that by the end of this lecture you'll be able to understand the historical context of this collection of cycled short stories in 1925. Be able to define the term associative cycling and find examples of it in the texts of In Our Time, and obviously third, be able to prepare to write an outline and a paper on Ernest Hemingway's short story collection In Our Time. Now let's begin with a couple quotes from Hemingway. The first one is that he said about In Our Time, which is, the title is an allusion to a biblical hymn. It says, "Oh, give us peace in our time, O Lord," certainly showing Hemingway's mother's influence, who she was deeply religious, and also Hemingway's desire to have an inner peace in his time, and certainly the larger time of the modern era, which was defined significantly by war. So he said this immediately about In Our Time. He said, reading the book is like looking at a landscape with binoculars. And so they get this hyper-focus on one particular aspect of the experience of pre-war, during war, and post-World War I. And then when you drop the binoculars, you see the entire landscape. Let's say you're looking at a coastline or you're looking at a Sawtooth mountain range. You see the hyper-focus on the rocky crags of Williams Peak. And then you drop the binoculars and you see that peak in the context of the whole panoramic Sawtooth Mountain landscape. Well, the same thing for Ernest Hemingway's In Our Time. You get this hyper-focus on, let's say, the shooting of the debilitated minister in the puddle during World War I, and then you drop the binoculars and you see that unwarranted cruelty toward the innocent, you see that excessive violence, you see the immorality of action of others, which are three motifs cycled through the book, is in the landscape when you drop the binoculars in everything. Pre-war stories like Indian Camp and Doctor and Doctor's Wife, to post-World War I stories or vignettes like the bullfighting, like the Greco-Turkish evacuation, the Greek evacuation from Turkey in that post-World War I war. And just take a look at the chapter cycle here. You know, first of all, the chapters are little tiny vignettes about a paragraph long. They're not really chapters, so he's very modern and undermining our expectation for a chapter. But take a look at this. I mean, he shows us that he begins with the key in Smyrna, 1922, and takes us to World War I, 1918. And then we return to post-war, and then back to World War I, and then post-war, and then back to World War I, and then post-war, back to World War I, and then the Greek desire to come to America to escape violence, which is highly ironic because that's not possible. And then, you know, one of the questions that I like to ask at the outset is, why does Hemingway shift from pre-war violence to wartime violence to post-war violence? And obviously the simple answer is to show the ubiquity of it, the inevitability of violence, and then that begs the question, well, once one comes to the conclusion that this is the world in which we live in, then how does one properly live in that world? And we get the Hemingway code of behavior that stems from that, which is really anticipating the whole course. But here's the definition of associative cycling. And it's cut off here, but we'll continue on the next slide. So associative cycling is defined by the term itself, right? There are images, emotions, ideas, dialogue, like Nick said nothing, or folded legs, or blankets covering up reality, or firelight, or excessive violence, environmental degradation, that is cycled through every chapter, remember those tiny little paragraphs, and the stories themselves, to show that pre-war, during war, and post-war, this is happening across a great expanse of time and a great expanse of landmass, right? It takes us to World War I over in Italy, and the post-World War I ramblings of expatriates, and he brings us obviously to pre-war America and post-war America. So in the next slide, definition. And so this moment is cycled in the same text and creates a sense of simultaneity. I think it's an important term for you to use in your paper. A simultaneity of experience. That is, this emotion, this image, this idea, this dialogue seems to be happening everywhere and at once. It creates a sense of inevitability of that idea or image, and the deterministic power of it, that one cannot escape its influence. Okay, and its influence upon the individual character, Nick Adams, and certainly upon you, the reader. So there are sort of two consciousnesses being formed here when you're reading Inner Time. There's a Nick Adams consciousness, pre-war violence and immorality, during war, post-war, and then there's the reader's consciousness. That is, wherever you turn, wherever you open up in our time, you're going to experience something that is shocking to you, that is horrifying to you. And if you just skip 40 pages and open up the book again, you would have a similar experience in a different landscape, in a different moment, a different context, yet the feeling of despair is the same. And that connects with the next sort of modern concept, which is the objective correlative, a T.S. Eliot concept, where he said, look, in poems, great poems, modern poems, there'll be a set of objects, a set of situations, a chain of events, which shall be the formula for a particular emotion. So with all the external facts, which must terminate in sensory experience, are given, the facts are given, the images are given, the events are given, the dialogue is established, one emotion is immediately evoked. And the emotion here that I think Hemingway's after is despair. And really capturing Nick's despair, Krebs's despair, the despair of those couples in post-World War I Europe. And so I'm just going to take a couple more Hemingway quotes before we actually get into an example of associative cycling. I think these are really interesting. They come from Hemingway's letters. I mean, he wrote this to his dad and his mom, who were very disgusted with the work, the short stories that Hemingway published up to 1925, and then again in his his collection of cycled stories in 1925 called Inner Time. He wrote this. He said, "Look, Mom and Dad, I'm trying in my stories to get the feeling of actual life across, to actually make it alive. So when you read something by me, you actually experience the thing. There's that direct treatment of the thing itself that was happening in American poetry. You can't do that without putting in the bad and the ugly as well as the beautiful, because if it is all beautiful, you can't believe in it. Things aren't that way. 3 dimensions in my writing, or if possible 4. So when you see anything of mine you don't like, remember that I'm sincere in doing it, and I'm working towards something. If I write a story that I might be hateful to you and Mother, the next one might be one you like exceedingly." So I think that's important here. Here he is stating in a letter in 1925 that his short stories are up to something. They're supposed to be read in context. Some are typifying the ugliness of life, while others will capture the beauty of life. Like in Big Two-Hearted River, there's a certain sense of beauty here, of his immersion into the natural scene of fly fishing. But then there's a context in which that antidote to despair lives. And there's lots of ugly stuff in our time. And so very important sense of reading a story in the context of other stories. And then here's something that Hemingway wrote about how he's trying to suppress his subjectivity, suppress his emotional reactions, or at least false emotional reactions. He said, "I found the greatest difficulty in writing, aside from knowing truly what you felt, rather than what you were supposed to feel and had been taught to feel, was to put down what really happened in action." So he wants to clean up his prose, get rid of adjectives and adverbs, get rid of telling the reader how to feel, and establish what the feeling was separate from what one is supposed to feel or constructed to feel. For example, war. This shooting of Germans climbing over a wall. The British take great pride in it, potting them, they say. It was terrible. They were frightfully put out when they had to fall away and stop potting Germans climbing over the wall. That's what they're supposed to feel. They're supposed to feel great pride, nationalistic pride. But what they really feel is, we can imagine, a sense of despair about the immorality of their actions, about how they have come to be this killing machine. So important concept. And then finally, last Hemingway quote is the tip of the iceberg. He said, "I always write on the principle of the iceberg. There's 7/8 of what I'm getting at in my stories underwater for every part that shows. Anything you know, you can eliminate, and it only strengthens your iceberg. It's the part that doesn't show." And so the stories we get are really just what the top part of the iceberg, and all the themes, the racism, the despair, the horror, The emotional reaction is suppressed and lives in the mind's eye of the reader and not in the story itself. I'm going to skip through a couple of these because we hit on the binocular idea. Then I want to get to, this critic. This is from the literary criticism called A Pretty Good Unity, in which you can see there's a cycling of racism, there's cycling of cruelty and violence, there's a cycling of disconnect between men and women, fathers and sons, mothers and sons. And I just want to take maybe two of these to show you how this critic helps us read in our time as a collection, a unified collection. He writes, in the epilogue, Hemingway shows the ultimate irony of war and the lugubrious quality of the Greek king whose sole concern is escaping to America, even though the recent devastating defeat of his people has resulted in many of them being herded together in refugee processions equivalent to the one described in Chapter 2. Cruelty, violence, and sudden death are not limited to the arena of war, but are shown to extend into civilian life and in peacetime in America. Post-World War I, Greco-Turkish War, cruelty, violence, sudden death. Peacetime in America, the killing, the death penalty scene, the hanging of Sam Cardinello, the shooting of the Hungarians. There it is. And so he goes on to say the shooting of the burglars in Chapter 8, the hanging of Sam Cardinello in Chapter 15. The effect of the recurrence of these violent scenes link together the pieces and suggests that the grounds upon which hope, love, and order can exist have been shattered in this world. Oh, give us peace in our time, O Lord. It's this realization that such figures as Nick, Krebs, and Joe must learn to accept if a new way to live with a semblance of meaning is to be found. And that's important, right? So once you realize that pre-war America is full of cruelty, violence, and sudden death, and unnecessary immorality of actions of others, and it's certainly during the war in Europe, and then post-war, there needs to be a new way to live in order to create a semblance of meaning in this world. We'll take another example and then we'll move on. The cycling of racism. This critic writes, the ugliness of the world and the interconnection of the stories and sketches are further suggested through the recurrence of the motifs of racism, unethical practices, and the spoiled environment. Just as war represents the violence of conflict between countries, racism can represent the latent violence between ethnic groups. For example, in Kansas City prisons of Chapter 15, the disproportionate number of blacks hanged, 3 out of 5, can reflect the dominance of the white majority over the black minority in America. The oppressive deference with which Black Bugs addresses Ad and Nick as Mr. Francis, Mr. Adams, respectively, in The Battler supports the same point, right? The vestiges of slavery and Jim Crow laws and the subordination of the African American race through legal means in this country. And in another instance, Dick Bolton's ability as a worker and doctor's wife is so highly respected by the white farmers that they decide he must be a white man and not a half-breed. The most frequent example of racism occurs through the use of the racial slur to convey hostility in an Indian camp. Uncle George curses the Indian woman, damn squaw bitch, the woman he possibly raped. And in Chapter 13, a Spanish matador describes Louis as an ignorant Mexican savage, and the policeman in Chapter 8, and the butler and Joe, mild men, refer to Italians as wops. Racism is everywhere, and there's a hyper-focus, a binocular view of racism in these little vignettes and stories, and when you drop the binoculars, you see the racism as ubiquitous and simultaneous across a large expanse of time and a large expanse of space. Whoops. Sorry about that. Okay, we're going to skip failed answer, and we're going to look at the essay question. So, let's look at this essay question. In keeping with modern fiction's focus on the construction of the self through social, physical, environmental, and psychological forces beyond one's individual control, Hemingway's book portrays how the self is constructed and annihilated by overpowering external and internal forces. So for Nick, it's certainly social. Disconnect from his family, disconnect from relationships with women, physical, he's shot in the spine, his legs won't work. There's environmental degradation, which shapes his view, and psychological is the most important one, where his whole consciousness is formed by the horrors that he's seen. As Frank Laturkia notes about the modern era, intensity and purity of perceptual pleasure is one of the goals of modernism, but the difficult, wistful dream of perception and the absence of pleasure is often its reality. It's a great way to open your paper with what Hemingway was doing, showing us the absence of pleasure and intense view of pre and post. World War I. So let's go on. Reading the book allows the reader to draw comparisons between the sources of despair and the means of escape or therapy pursued by Nick Adams. The sources of despair that form the consciousness of Nick Adams are cycled through the stories and chapters. Associative cycling in modern literature means that an idea, an emotion, an image, or dialogue established in a text cycles through the other moments in the same text and creates a sense of simultaneity of experience. That is, this emotion, idea, dialogue seems to be happening everywhere. It often forces the reader to recognize the deterministic powers of the idea, the emotion, image, or dialogue upon the individual character and you, the reader. And that's your goal. You're going to try to prove that. You're going to choose one idea, one motif, one image, and show how it's cycled through and how it shapes both Nick's consciousness and the reader's consciousness. So let's take a look at some of the examples, and you can find your own, but here's some help of cycled images or ideas throughout the text. There's excessive, random, unmerciful violence. Nick punched off the train. The soldier being shot in the firing squad, potting the Germans climbing over the walls, the excessive, unmerciful violence toward the bulls in the bullfighting, toward the baggage animals in a quay at Smyrna. There's cruelty toward the innocent, immoral action of others, a disconnect between men and women, right? Nick does not have a connection with Marjorie. He breaks it off. He regrets it. Doesn't have a connection with his mother. Doesn't have a connection with his father. And hardly has a connection with other men outside of the soldiers at war. Racism, as we talked about. The loss of the rural agrarian life of Hortons Bay, Michigan for the machine of war and industry. Environmental degradation all over the place. The loss of the lumber mill industry because the forests have been cut down. The intimate relationship between life and death in this shows the vulnerability of life. How others perceive you determines your acceptance or your rejection, not necessarily who you are. Nick punched off the train. Nick accused by the battler, the prize fighter, as having stolen his food. The folding legs of the baggage animals, the picador horses are everywhere. We already mentioned disconnected ones. Goes on. So, in the standard essay, you're going to choose one of the cycling images, and you're going to show us through quotes and analysis how it's cycled everywhere. You're going to use one quote from A Pretty Good Unity. The literary criticism I quoted from above, it's also on the website. And you're going to mention some of the stylistic concepts like imagism, adjective correlative, direct treatment of the thing, tip of the iceberg, on chronological narration, things we've touched on. There's some more concepts right here as well that you can mention. Honors essay will go a little bit further and after establishing what the cycled image is or dialogue is, you'll show how the antidotes to despair, the traditional antidotes to despair, marriage, family life, religion, physical immersion in nature, finding solidarity among peers, coded individuals, completing tasks well, more specific family relationships, father-son, mother-daughter relationships, how these are the beginnings of antidotes to despair in our time, but have failed to, at this moment in Nick's life, and you could argue in Hemingway's life, failed to become the antidote. So a little bit more from our honors students. So let's look at it. Let's end this lecture by walking through from back to front, from the end of the story to the beginning of the story, how the cycled idea of unwarranted, undeserved cruelty toward the innocents is everywhere, pre, during, and post World War I. So here he is in Big Two-Hearted River. At the very tail end, we see that his returns to northern Michigan of Indian camp, and he remembers fishing rivers where those who have been unwarrantedly cruel toward trout by not wetting their hands before they touch the trout and ruining their protective layer and eventually killing them. He writes, he wet his hand before he touched the trout so that he would not disturb the delicate mucus that covered him. If a trout was touched by a dry hand, a white fungus attacked the unprotected spot. Years before, when he fished crowded streams with fly fishermen ahead of him and behind him, Nick had again and again come upon dead trout, furry with white fungus, drifting against a rock or floating belly up in some pool. So here is this unspoken code among fishermen. He's disgusted by the idea that those would be careless in not wetting their hands and cause violence toward the innocent. More coded stuff. Chapter 11. In the bullfighting post-World War One, the bull was too tired from so much bad sticking. He folded his knees and lay down. The crowd was shouting all the time and threw pieces of bread down into the ring. Here we have this idea that there's a code in bullfighting, and that when you are to kill a bull, you're supposed to kill him right between his shoulder blades and get his heart and kill him with dignity and honor and courage, not the bad sticking that's cruel and causes a slow, awful death. Here's more cruelty toward the innocent in a bullfight. The white horse kneed himself up in chapter 10. The horse's entrails hung down in a blue bunch. The monos were whacking him on the back of the legs. Blood pumped regularly from between the horse's front legs. These are picador horses. The picadors are trying to get the bull enraged by putting lances in him. Also cruelty toward the innocent. Here he is witnessing all this and cycling back to these other moments, like the trout dead in the pool, like the bull and all the bad sticking from a previous bullfight. And here's Nick's consciousness again, remembering his own legs, folding his own reception of cruelty toward the innocent. He sat against the wall of a church, highly ironic, and they had dragged him to be clear of the machine gun fire. Both legs stuck out awkwardly. He'd been hit in the spine. It was going well. We've made our separate peace. Nick says, our separate peace from this war, not a peace achieved by a treaty. But here's Nick himself, the ultimate innocent, fighting for his country and being shot in the spine and knowing the cruelty toward the innocent firsthand. Even before the war, he's jumped on a train to go enlist in the army in Chicago, and he's on the back of the caboose, and Nick stood up. He was all right. He looked up at the track, the light of the caboose. He felt his knee. The pants were torn and the skin barked. His hands were scraped, and there were sand and cinders driven up under those nails. That lousy crater of Brakeman, come here, kid. I got something for you. And then wham, he lit on his hands and knees before the track. Nick rubbed his eye. There was a big lump coming up. So here we have delayed decoding, right? This modernist technique where Nick's catching up with himself and realizing that the brakeman at the end of the caboose was having some fun with him and wanted to see how far he would fling this kid off the train by punching him. Cruelty toward an innocent even before the war. Here's one during the war. They shot the 6 cabinet ministers at 6:30 in the morning against the hospital. Again, the shutters of the hospital shut, doesn't want to see it. One of the ministers was sick with typhoid. They tried to hold him up against the wall, but he sat down in a puddle of water when they fired the first volley, presumably into his head. The minister was sitting down in the water with his head on his knees. So here we have something we think we can project that Nick would witness during World War I. They show no empathy in this firing squad. They show no sense of wrongdoing. Here's an individual who's contracted typhoid, prisoner of war, being shot, and unable to stand up. Something that haunts Nick's consciousness. I presume Hemingway's as well. And then finally, it takes us all the way back to the beginning of the story, which is ironically, chronologically, the very end of events, which is the Greco-Turkish War after World War I. When the Greeks are evacuating Turkey, they can't take their baggage animals with them, so they break their legs and let them die slowly in this body of water called a quay. So the Greeks were nice chaps too. He says, writes ironically, when they evacuated all their baggage animals they couldn't take off with them, so they just broke their forelegs and dumped them into the shallow water. So you have a couple things working here. You have folded legs being cycled through here, the images, but the larger idea that I chose to focus on was cruelty toward the innocent. Nick sees this everywhere at once, before the war, during the war, after the war. And again, the question that this begs is, once one realizes this is existence, this is one's life, that there is cruelty toward the innocent everywhere, what next? How does one find a way to live in it? Well, one of the code principles should be to complete tasks well, value solidarity, right? 2 code principles, to live your life in such a way that you would not be cruel to others, other human beings, other animals, and they would take great pride in conducting yourself well and preventing yourself from contributing to unnecessary violence, unethical behavior, and the cruelty toward the innocent of others. I hope this helps you frame your idea. You can certainly use these quotations for folded legs or for cruelty toward the innocent, and allows you to get a great leap forward toward writing your paper on the cycling ideas in our time that unifies this short story collection. And I look forward to reading your papers.